Hello, Jack.
Hello, Kaveh. How are you?
Thank you so much. Thank you for attending here. I'm so glad to see you here.
I'm super happy to be here, and I'm trying to get the camera right. I also decided to try to do it outside, so if there is noise or if my dog starts playing with his squeaker toy, which he does at all important moments, I
That
will change locations.
although most of people here know you well, but let me begin with a brief interview, introducing a few. Jack Russell Weinstein is an American philosopher. He's teaching now at North Dakota University, specializing in political philosophy, liberal theory. He is the director of the Institute for Philosophy in Public Life and also the host of the public radio show named Why. Our friendship proudly is now more than 10 years old. It dates back to, for me, for translating a book Jack was written named On MacIntyre. Alistair MacIntyre is a famous contemporary Scottish philosopher. And I'm honored to develop the friendship during the last decade or so. I'm so honored that you accepted my invitation, Jack, to talk about the world after the pandemic. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, it is my absolute pleasure. I am so indebted to you for your work, for you initiating the contact 10 years ago, for making my book look so much better and making me sound so much more important in the introduction. My relationship with you and with the Iranian scholars and students is one of my proudest achievements as a person and as a professor. So you call and I come. It is perfectly clear.
Thank you so much for your kindness. Since I know you are an ex-activist, let me ask you first an irrelevant question. Recently, we saw a tragic piece of movie, a police officer murdering a black man named George Floyd, and after that, protests spread across the United States over Floyd death. What is happening there? Are we witnessing racism in 21st century in a modern democratic country like United States? It reminds me a quote by Theodore Adorno, the leftist thinker, sociologist from the so-called Frankfurt School. No history leads from savagery to humanitarianism, but from slingshot to megaton bombs. You are not as pessimist as Theodore Adorno, I think, are you?
I don't know, whether I'm a pessimist or not depends on minute by minute, right? This is a very difficult thing to watch. I actually don't think it's an irrelevant question. I think it's a tremendously relevant, important question, because some of what's happening is a consequence to the frustration with the American government and how it's dealt with the virus. There's a long-standing history of racism in the United States. However democratic we may or may not be, we have not dealt with our legacy of slavery well. We have not dealt with our legacy of segregation well. So I don't want to diminish in any way, shape, or form that this is first and foremost a response to racism and a response to police brutality. At the same time, it's also a response to an administration that has been dismantling the federal government, an administration that, if it has an ideology at all, it's anti-government. And when an anti-government administration is the government, then the government becomes smaller and it becomes less responsive. The pandemic has been horrible everywhere. It's certainly been horrible in Iran. It's been horrible in Europe. We're now seeing it expand to places it hasn't before. But it's much worse in the United States than it could have been because of the disinterest. And what has happened over the last 2-3 months is the administration has tied, and other organizations, behind the scenes organizations, has tied the pandemic to a lot of the issues that are tangential to racism. So you see these protests, and I'm sure you've seen them on the Iranian media, or at least on the internet, these protests requesting that people open up shops and end the quarantine, but they're being held by gun rights advocates. And they're being held largely by white racists who have made a connection between what they're calling the loss of freedom from the pandemic and the larger issues, excuse me, in terms of our Second Amendment, in terms of our racism. And so what we're seeing in the response is people who are incredibly pent up and frustrated by the virus response and the virus and the pandemic, triggered by this indefensible activity from the police.
Exactly, exactly. Different events simultaneously happened and caused that event. I think. Jack, as you mentioned, we are experiencing a completely novel situation. A pandemic overshadows the world, brings about an apocalyptic situation, just as we saw on apocalyptic novels and movies. William Shakespeare has a quote that past is prologue. We have seen some kind of these pandemics during our history, during human history. The most famous one is the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, or the famous Spanish flu in 1918. But how is a pandemic in 2020 different from a pandemic in the past?
Technology makes things different. Ways of communicating makes things different. But, and I'm going to use an old-fashioned phrase here, human nature keeps things the same. And when you look at the accounts of the 1918 pandemic, when you look at Daniel Defoe, who's most famous for writing Robinson Crusoe, wrote a diary of a book called, I think, The Diary of the Plague Year, or an account of the plague year, which talks about a plague in the 1766, I believe. I can't remember exactly. And it's the same account. It's the same experience of people being angry about having to be isolated, protesting, all this sort of stuff. I'm going to talk about something that seems a little irrelevant, but I don't think it is. My daughter has a favorite map. I know this seems a little odd, but she has a favorite map, and it's a map of the Black Plague. And if I were on a computer instead of the phone, I try to find it for all of you, and it shows Europe and destruction in the Black Plague. And all of the countries are decimated except Poland, right? So you see the red, the color for all of the deaths. And Poland is clear. And why is Poland clear? It's clear because Poland had the largest concentration of Jews at that time. And in the Jewish religious rituals, like in Muslim religious rituals, washing and washing your hands in particular is part of the ritual. So since they didn't have a germ theory, and since they didn't know how the viruses were transmitted, the Jews were, I guess, relatively untouched. So the first thing is you see a population, their behavior that's protected. But then this is one of the births of modern anti-Semitism, because people decided that since the Jews weren't dying, they were causing the deaths because they were poisoning the wells, right? So again, you see a pandemic that is tied to bigotry, that's tied into hatred, that's tied into
conspiracy theories.
Yes, absolutely. And so the group has changed, although there's always, as you know, anti-Semitic theories about every catastrophe, but we can talk about that, but we don't have to, right? But what you see then is communities isolating oneself and blaming others. And the nouns change, the names change, the groups change, but the patterns stay exactly the same. And I'm sure that in other histories, in Asian history, in African history, in Persian history, and Arab history, you will see these same sorts of patterns, although you have to maybe be more of a scholar to be able to identify the groups and the boundaries from the literature.
Thank you so much, Jack. Do you think life never be the same again after this calamity? I mean, crisis will push us on another path, a totally different path. How might the world be different after the pandemic?
I knew, of course, you were going to ask me this question because this was the topic, and I have struggled to find an answer that is more sophisticated than it really isn't. But the first way to respond is actually something that a psychologist I know talked about. She's a sports psychologist, and she's talking about athletes' reactions to the pandemic. And she says that in times of crisis, people tend to think of as all or nothing behaviors, that everything is going to be completely different or exactly the same. And that this is actually just a psychological reaction to crisis. My mother, who I'm sure at some point will watch this video as well, she lives in the center of Manhattan, obviously in one of the hot spots in the world and one of the most dense populations in the world. And about 2 or 3 weeks in, we had a very emotional conversation in which she said, I'm going to have to leave New York City. New York City is never going to recover from this. All of these stores are going to be destroyed, and there's going to be no reason to stay here. And of course, that's not what's going to happen. There will be fewer stores for a while. There will be terrible economic consequences, but New York will endure, just like Paris will endure, just like Tehran will endure, just like Beijing will endure. And so the first trick to getting past this question is to get past our all or nothing attitude. And so then I would challenge you to ask the question in a more precise way. Will our politics change? Will our ways of engaging in romance change? Will our modes of education change? When you ask those questions, maybe I can offer a more precise answer, but the global question, like the great global questions, what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? These are they're too both big and amorphous to hold on to.
Exactly. By the way, did the healthcare system in US proven to be adequate? Were you satisfied with the state or not?
The healthcare in the United States proved to be the healthcare in the United States. And what I mean by that, again, consistent with what I said before, is that we have one of the few, I hate this term, but developed countries in the world, and certainly one of the few the only Western country in the world, also a term I hate, that does not have universal healthcare. And we have a healthcare that divides rich and poor, that divides rural and urban, that prioritizes elective surgeries and medication as opposed to emergency surgery and preventative medicine. And so the American healthcare system has proven to be exactly that. So two things have happened simultaneously. The first is, regionally, there have been better or worse responses. So the personal protection equipment, the ventilators and things like that, some areas have been have had more access than others, depending on preconditions. But also, interestingly enough, a lot of hospitals are going out of business. A lot of hospitals are becoming bankrupt and are firing massive numbers of doctors and nurses, because what's happening are that the elective surgeries, the plastic surgeries, the long-term back pain or foot pain, or tests for colon cancer, things like that. People are not doing that right now. They're staying away from the doctor, and this is how hospitals make money. Right? And this is how hospitals keep in business. And if they can't charge $100 for an aspirin, and if they can't charge $5,000 for a back scan, then they can't make money. And so while the American healthcare system has been the most, I can't think of the term, we need it more now than we've needed it in recent history, it's also falling apart for lack of money. And that's because it's privately funded. It's because it's a capitalist healthcare system. And when markets fail, or when markets go through great distortions, the large scale businesses fail as well.
Thank you. Jack, we can see that European Union, I mean countries in the so-called visa-free zone, the Schengen area, have reimposed borders again after decades. I'm sorry to say that. Oh, we saw that none of the European countries helped Italy for medical services. How do you see the pandemic changing the balance of power globally? Are we going to experience a strong resurgence of a kind of nationalism or protectionism, or will the populist fractions rise out of the calamity?
Again, some of this is what preceded it. So very controversially, the American President Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. Did it, I think it was in his first year in office. And it's unclear whether he did anything to deserve it. But in my opinion, and I think I actually wrote a piece about it at one point, or a monologue for one of the earliest radio shows, I argued that there was a defense for it. And what he did better than any president before, and certainly since, is restore the idea of cosmopolitanism, restore the idea that we are a human race in one world, and that the notion of borders are artificial in some important way. Now, those aren't his terms, those are mine, but this is a philosophy interview, right? So this commitment, ideological, political, social commitment to cosmopolitanism is incredibly important. We have seen, not just in the United States, but in Hungary, in Germany, and in other places as well, a shift to power in the right wing. Austria has struggled with this for the last couple decades. Certainly we've seen this in various different forms in the Middle East. And with this right-wing movement comes a return to nationalism and a return to separation and stronger borders. So this was happening beforehand. But then you get this idea that pandemics are transported and transmuted via moving populations. And once you have that idea, then you're going to want to counter those borders. So the question then becomes, and again, this is a philosophical question, does capitalism, do markets, does a global economy work better if we risk porous borders in order to maximize markets? Or do we have what they call protectionist now, or they used to call mercantilism? Do we have this idea that, well, we can have a socially protected community, but still have global trade? And I keep going back to this because whether one is a capitalist or not, whether one agrees with capitalism or thinks, and whatever capitalism is of course a whole larger conversation. It is the dominant economic ideology of the world. And the classical economists argued that it wasn't in fact an ideology at all, that it was just the natural state of human beings, that truck, barter, and exchange, in Adam Smith's terms, truck, barter, and exchange was a natural condition for human beings. And so a lot of what is going to happen after the coronavirus is going to depend on what the markets do and what capitalism does, and whether or not these economic concerns are stronger and more powerful than the social concerns. Sometimes that's very good because economics doesn't care who's spending the dollar. They don't care if they're Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Jewish or atheist or whatever. A dollar is a dollar. But communities care, and governments care, and individuals sometimes care. And so, sometimes the market is a really good integrationist approach, an egalitarian approach. But sometimes the markets are terrible, because markets if markets do good things, they do good things over wide sweeps of humanity, over long periods of time, and it destroys individual lives, right? And in the name, an analogy for a second, we have a business here, a sports store that has a big display of animals, of animals that had been hunted and then stuffed on display. And in the sign it says, hunting is good for animals because hunting protects wildlife. You know, we want to keep the deer alive for hunting. We want to keep the grouse alive for hunting. And an environmental philosopher was visiting, and we took her to see this display, and she said, no, hunting is not good for animals. Hunting is good for species. And I think that's the same distinction here. It's good for species because the deer population exists over time, the bear population exists over time if there's a conservation movement, but it's bad for individual animals because they're killed and they're eaten, right? And this is the same thing in capitalism. Capitalism may very well be good for humanity, and it may be very good for nations, but for individuals, it depends on the individual. And so ultimately, I think the debate over what happens with the coronavirus is going to be a debate between market forces and social forces, and who wins and who has more power at any given moment.
Exactly. And my next question is about economy also, economics. We see not only a public health crisis, but also a market crisis. The pandemic will cause much more debt in public sector and also private sector. What are the biggest impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the global economy? Are we going to experience a new Great Depression or some kind of recession? And is it manageable?
Well, let me do that backwards. There are important comparisons between the Great Depression and what's happening now, but they're not exact comparisons for a variety of reasons. First, as I said before, technology is very different and the ability to communicate is very different. And so people couldn't work at home during the Great Depression, but they can telecommunicate here and now. Second, during the Great Depression, at least in the United States, and I think this was true throughout Europe as well, in Iran, although I also don't know, because I guess the Great Depression was between the two wars, so the Middle East, as we understood it now, is pretty much exact in the map. We had single income households in the Great Depression, and now we have two income households in the Western capitalist countries. And so you can have a 25% unemployment rate in the United States, for example, like you did in the Great Depression, but still not have the same kind of mass starvation because one person is working instead of no one is working, right? So the comparison is not exact. At the same time, what we're going to see is concentration of wealth and concentration of businesses. So markets, and certainly contemporary markets, tend towards concentration. Airlines will buy small airlines. Apple Computer, we see this over and over again. There'll be an app that does that is successful, and so Apple buys the company and then gives it away for free and then destroys the company. And so the first thing we're going to see is tremendous consolidation, and the airlines are going to survive. Excuse me, I apologize. The airlines are good, but there are going to be fewer of them. The large-scale companies are going to survive, but there'll be fewer of them. Amazon is going to be more of a power than it's been before, and it's probably the most important company in the world today. But people are going to lose their job. I mean, people are losing their jobs massively. People are not going to get rehired because part of what happens is that management uses this as an excuse to do things that they wanted to do anyway. So they say, let me take these off for just a second. Sorry, it's the radio person in me. I didn't want to clear my throat on the microphone. A department store fires 100 workers and they say, well, this is for the pandemic. They're not going to rehire 100 workers. They're going to rehire 20 workers, right? And they're going to hire them at lower rates, and they're going to, and there's going to be greater demand. And so salaries are going to go down. Quality of life is going to go down. Life expectancy is going to go down. Access to healthcare is going to go down. And corporate consolidation is going to increase, so it's going to divide the rich and the poor. It's also going to divide the rich and the poor countries. And what we've seen in the United States is that while it is a rich country, it behaves like a poor country. While it is the wealthiest country in the world, again, I'm going to use a term for convenience that I don't particularly like, it is it behaves like a third world country. In its healthcare system, in its racial segregation, in its the corruption of its police, and especially increase in corruption now on the federal level. And I'm going to say something mean about a different country, and I don't mean to diminish its worth, but I have been warning. My wife has heard me say this for many, many years, that America is becoming Brazil. And I believe in true capitalist form, I said about 10 years ago, my probably only claim to fame in my family is that I predicted the 2008 Great Recession. and I said to her very early on when we ended up in North Dakota is, we are going to become Brazil. There is only going to be a rich and a poor. There's not going to be a middle class. And if those are the two options, I want to be rich, right? Purely self-interested. Brazil is a mess right now. It's a mess politically. It's a mess in terms of the virus. It's certainly a mess economically. And this is the road that America is going. The great question, and the question that liberals in America are asking is this a time that we can use the circumstances to have a more robust universal healthcare system, to have a more robust social network, social net, to have more robust welfare system? If the Democrats get in power, and if the Democrats can be competent, which they're not very good at being, then there is a possibility that this can happen. If the Republicans stay in power, it's absolutely not going to happen. Now, but also then it's whether the Democrats can move people to a vision, and whether the more left-wing part of the party can move the Democrats away from the center to a more robust notion of public assistance. And so again, what happens, we are at a moment in the world, but certainly in the United States and in Europe, but especially in the United States, we are at a moment of a great crossroads. And whether or not we can take that for the better option depends entirely on the people. Now, I know that, I mean, I don't know much about Iran, and I don't want to talk too much about Iranian politics because I don't know what is proper and what is improper. I'm a guest in your country, and so I don't want to do that. But certainly there has got to be a conversation about how this virus has either strengthened or weakened the current regime, and whether or not the virus has strengthened or weakened the balance of power between the religious and, say, the more secular forces in your country, although secular is different in your country than it is in ours. Whether the virus has strengthened or weakened the role of women in Iran, and more liberal interpretations of Islam and things like that. So every country is going to have these debates, and ultimately, as we know from the history of Iran, as much as the history of the United States, the will of the people and their ability to respond and organize, and their ability to resist conservative forces, and I mean something very specific by that, which I'll say in a second, is going to determine what happens. And by conservative, I don't mean a political party. I don't mean the regime or not the regime, or one denomination or another denomination. What I mean is the party that has control and that looks towards the past, right? I always tell my students, the way to understand the difference between liberal and conservative is, for a liberal, all else equal, change is good. That a liberal wants change and believes that improvement can only come through change, whereas a conservative wants to conserve the present, wants to keep things the same. Right, exactly right. A radical who's left wants radical change, completely overthrow the system, whereas a liberal, a progressive, wants incremental change. And a reactionary, which is a right-wing conservative, wants things not just to stay the same, but to go back in time. Right? If I had a blackboard again, I would draw the line that I draw for my students. But So when I say that the question is whether or not conservative forces will prevail, I don't mean to step in Iranian politics. What I mean is simply without the will of the people being listened to and being engaged in any country, there will either be positive change, meaning actual change, or things will stay the same or regress. And conservative forces will always make them stay the same, and that will tend towards regression. So I don't even remember the question I was answering.
We were talking about that. Will there be a new Great Depression, or can we compare it with the crisis of 2008 in the United States? Maybe it's more similar to our current situation, isn't it?
I think it's it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, it's like 2008 in the sense that those folks who and it didn't look like this at first, but this is certainly the case, and I'm confident of this, with one footnote. Those people who remained employed and who had investments in the stock market, when all of this is over, they're going to be very well off. Right? When all of this is over, the stock market is going to be stronger and better higher than it's ever been. Unless what we're seeing in the United States now is really the prelude to a revolution, which I don't think it is, then all bets are off. But assuming that the basic infrastructure of the United States stays intact, and in any place that has stock markets, those people are going to be well off. And that's what happened in 2008. The people who had access to liquid money, the money that they could spend, the people who had investments, they came out with better rates on mortgages, lower debt, better houses, and higher retirement incomes. And everyone else was decimated and has been feeling the consequences on their salaries and on their debt ever since. And they were only starting to get out of the hole a little bit when this happened. So it's going to be like 2008 in that respect. The reason why it might be like the Great Depression is if, again, the Democrats come into power and can initiate a great public works project, then we can, return the economy to some sort of functioning it can function for a larger group of people, but also then it will shift. What the works program really did was shift the nature of work in the United States and the nature of work in the world economy, because people did different kinds of jobs in the United States and in Europe, especially after Europe is complicated because of the World War II and the role of the Marshall Plan. But the basic pattern, I think, happens, but in a slower way, which is that what the Great Depression saw in the United States was a massive increase in government employment, right? And government-sponsored projects. And I forget what the number is. I think 20% of employment in the United States is government employment. Don't quote me on that number, but I think it's something like 20%. If we do see a major public works shift, then we're going to see a major shift in work again. We're going to see a shift in more telecommunication jobs. We're going to see a work in more isolated workplaces and disparate workplaces. So more people are working at home and more people are working in pods, and there'll be more flexible work in some way. But we also may see a return to what they call in English the gig economy, the Ubers and the Lyfts and all of those sorts of things. So there's elements of the Great Depression and there's elements of 2008. And if you're looking at the experience at the moment, it's not as clear as to which one it's more like, but 10 years from now, we'll have a sense. What I will say, though, is again, around the world, what you're seeing is an increase in bread lines and an increase in public assistance for food. But now this is largely privately driven. And it all may change the nature of charity and assistance in the United States, especially if the Republicans stay in power, where public assistance will become entirely privatized and engagement on the state level, and the federal government is going to walk away from that completely.
Thank you so much. Jack, you mentioned the negative sides of the catastrophe, but are there any industries that might benefit this situation? We know that, of course, this situation leads to cultivating new habits. For instance, washing our hands properly, or shaping new travel habits. But can we enumerate some positive outcomes of this situation for economy or for the human condition generally?
You know, very early on in the pandemic, there was a tweet that was very popular from a guy who said, wait a minute, y'all weren't washing your hands before? and this idea that people weren't washing their hands aggressively, I try not to think about it. There's also a sort of a long-standing joke on the internet about how the great beneficiaries of the pandemic have been house pets, because now their owners are home all of the time, right? There are positive aspects, but like always, the positive aspects depend on your circumstance and your economic means, right? So I live in a low population density area. And my small American city, about 55,000, 60,000 people, university town with a hospital and some agricultural industries. I get on my bicycle, and 10 minutes of riding, I am in farmland. And I can do 55-mile, I don't know, 80, 85 kilometer ride, and not see a single person, right? And this has been, running and cycling have been tremendous help for me and my mental health and my mental stability. But again, my mother, who lives in Manhattan, or my father and his wife, who live right outside in the suburbs, they can't do these things, right? And so, yes, there are lots of people who are using this opportunity to develop exercise habits, to spend more time with their family, to clean out their kitchen cupboards, to organize their life in a certain way. But at the same time, there is an increase in substance abuse, people who are alone, who are drinking very heavily. And I know that in Iran, despite, again, and not wanting to step on any terms, there are plenty of drinkers in Iran, even though both Islam and the government forbid it. And those people are probably drinking more, right? And there's drug addiction across the world that is significantly worse. There's domestic violence has gotten significantly worse. Obesity has gotten worse. And so, like all human problems, with every positive is a negative. The optimist wants to say, with every negative, there's a positive. But I actually don't think that's true, because there's no positive of the Syrian refugees who are trapped in the camps, waiting to be decimated, if not by war and if not by poverty, then the coronavirus. There's no positive for the genocide in Rwanda or in the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide, right? So I think it's true that for every positive there's a negative, but I don't necessarily think that's true that for every negative there's a positive. And that's one of the reasons why human life is so difficult, right? This is the human condition. And since human life is so difficult, we need each other and we need government to make it easier. And when governments fail, societies fail. I'm sorry that's not a more optimistic answer. Yeah, I am sorry that's not a more optimistic answer.
I'm not looking for optimism also. We are living in the era of neoliberalism, I might say. I mean, in the age of dominancy of a kind of individualism, egoism, and in an age of vast consumerism, an age of economics, as the American philosopher Todd May labeled it. In this situation, the pandemic changed some of our established habits. For instance, we used to shake hands for greeting. We used to kiss each other. We used to hug each other. But we have prohibited these habitual behaviors. We have prohibited gatherings of any kind, close gatherings. Does it lead to a more individualistic situation, or if you wish, to a more atomistic situation with less social solidarity, less compassion, less altruism? Remember what happened during the toilet paper shortage in some places in the world. And
well, the first thing is I would distinguish between individualism and atomism, right? We can be individualistic and still be communities and still learn from each other and be collective, whereas atomism is much more isolationism. I also, again, have to caution us by suggesting that, yes, it's true that many people hug and shake hands, but many people don't based on cultural lines. So there are cultures where men can't shake hands with other women, right? And where in the United States, I haven't seen any sociological studies, but I am sure that African Americans shake hands with each other and whites shake hands with each other more than they shake hands with one another, right? There's class lines as well. So these social habits that designate connectedness are also themselves bound by cultural norms. Now, at the same time, right, I think of my daughter. My daughter's 14. Yes, and you know her and of her, and on the one hand, she has one friend that she sees regularly that we have allowed, who lives on the street. We have rules that they break when we're not looking, but nevertheless, right? They're 14, but she is on social networks all day, every day, right? She makes herself a snack. She does an arts and craft activity, and she does it on Instagram Live, right? And she has house party, and she has all these projects and all these things. And so in some ways, her life was at least as social or more social than it was 4 months ago, in part because as parents, we've just stopped telling her to get off the phone, right? 6 months ago, when she could do all of these other things, we'd say, get off the phone, stop doing this, but now we know that it's her lifeline. Again, excuse me, my mother, right? I'm talking about my mother a lot, which will please her very much when she watches this. My mother says that because she's of an older generation, she's turning 80 this year. She spends all day on the phone, right? She is of the generation where phones are for talking this way instead of talking like you and I are, and she's talking all of the time, right? She's had 2 in-person conversations in a park, social distance, in 11 weeks, but she's talking to everyone. So the conservative forces in our society will say this does not count as social interaction. This does not count as true intimacy. On the other hand, I think the more liberal, more modern forces will say, no, this is a tremendous form of interaction, and it's very meaningful. We know, of course, that sexual life is now largely engaged in virtually, which on the one hand is a distortion of what human sexuality is. On the other hand, fewer unwanted pregnancies, fewer sexually transmitted diseases, and fewer rapes, right? So one of the things that this is exacerbating is the wrong word. One of the great unknowns of this point in time is the consequence of this going to be that the younger generation's model of social activity and technological interaction, is that now going to dominate? and I actually haven't seen any discussions of this, any large-scale discussions of this online or anywhere, that one of the consequences of this may be that the older generations are going to now start to adopt the younger generation method of dating and meeting and engaging in things. But then when it's all over, maybe people return to old habits, right? One of the things, right, when our daughter was first born and we were very tired, a colleague said, one of us, my wife said to the colleague, oh, you know, things are going so slowly. He said, yes, the individual hours go so slow and the days go by so quickly. Right? Anyone who has kids knows this experience, right? Your child won't stop crying or you can't sleep and every minute is turmoil, but then you look back and all of a sudden they're 5 years old, right? We're going to look back at this 3-month, 5-month, 8-month period of time that seemed to drag on forever, and it's going to be a blip, because even someone who lives 60 or 70 years in their life, only 3-4 months is only 3-4 months. It's a tremendously consequential 3-4 months, but the ability of people to return back to old habits is relentless and overpowering. And so ultimately, I think the question is, which fork in the road are we going to take? And that's going to depend a lot on the younger voices. So yesterday I was at 2 different protests. I shared videos on my social networks. I was at 2 different protests. I was down in Fargo, which is a city twice the size of where I am in Grand Forks, about 120,000 people in the combination of 2 towns, and there was 2,000 people in anti-police brutality protests. And then we came back. I went for a 7.5-mile run, and then we went to a candlelight vigil in the next town over, East Grand Forks, which is a town of several thousand, and there were probably about 100 people there. 90% of the people there were under 30. Easily 90% of the people were young, energetic activists who really wanted to have their voice heard. And the older population is doing nothing. And what I have seen from this generation, and I don't know if this is true in Iran, I'd be very curious to find out if it's true. And this is the consequence of Twitter and social network connections. This generation is an activist generation. This generation has in its soul the need and the desire to change the world. And you asked me about optimism earlier. And I get my optimism from seeing my daughter. I get my optimism from seeing what a robust both conception of justice and commitment to justice that my daughter and her friends have. And conceptions of justice in groups that 20 years ago, 30 years ago would be unthinkable, right? Gender fluidity and gender identity and sexual identity, but also different types of religious behavior and different types of social interactions and different expectations from school and different ways of interacting with one's teachers and one's parents. And I look at the potential from her and her friend group, and I don't say, well, okay, we're going to be fine. But I do say, well, okay, they haven't knocked the fight out of us yet. My generation, Generation X, is tired. Generation Z or Generation Y, the generation in between my generation and her generation, they're non-existent. They're silent. The baby boomer generation, they're completely self-involved the way they always have been, which is one of the reasons why we've gotten in this situation in the first place. But her generation, they have so much fight in them. It is tremendously awe-inspiring. And what I will say, though, is one of the scenarios that I haven't seen people suggest is that what the next decade is going to look like is not like the 1950s or the 2000s, but the 1920s. Because the reason why the Roaring '20s existed was that you had a generation that went to war in World War I that suddenly went to war unexpectedly, that was decimated. And then they come back and they face a world pandemic. Sound familiar? And so all social and sexual mores change. And you have the Roaring '20s because the youngest generation said, look, if we're all going to die at 25, we might as well drink as much, have as much sex, and have as much fun as we can before we go, right? And so there is a possibility that when all of this is over, what that generation will do is just say, the heck with it, we're all in. But what I think will happen, if their character stays the same, what I think will happen that will be different than the Roaring '20s is that they will try to do it from the perspective of justice. I have a piece on my blog, pqed.org, philosophicalquestionseveryday.org, which is pqed.org. And it is, the question is, who do we vote for when the younger generation disagrees with us, right? So it's ostensibly about the American election. But what it's really about is this concert that I went to that was, I don't know what the Persian equivalent, if there is a term, a queer concert, a concert that catered to different sexualities and different sexual orientations and sexual identities. And I talk of, yes, LGBTQ population. And I write about what it's like to be a parent figure in this. And one of the things that I talk about is that while these young people were having a spectacular time and celebrating and engaging in what many people would have thought of as verbally offensive behavior, they were all tremendously caring for each other and tremendously cautious and keeping people at a safe space. And as I said in the article, something like, I do not think that a single person hooked up that night. There was no one in the corner making out with each other, which is always what happened at our concerts, at our parties and things like that. And when I was younger, this was a place where people were first and foremost safe. And then within the confines of safety, tremendously happy and celebratory socially. And I'd like to think that if the generation takes that 1920s route, and there is another Roaring '20s, which I guess would be the Roaring '20s, actually giving the dates, right? If there's another Roaring '20s, that it will be a Roaring '20s that is much more conscious of justice and inclusion than the one that followed the First World War.
Exactly. Thank you so much for your answer. Nowadays, governments confronts with a horrible dilemma: bring things back or shut things down. Do you think it's right to start businesses and in industries up again? To end the lockdown, even though it's harmful for many people. Do you agree with the utilitarian approach of herd immunity, the so-called herd immunity?
I honestly don't know. And part of the reason why I don't know is that people are behaving very poorly. If we opened up businesses and everyone wore masks and everyone engaged in social distancing and everyone behaved responsibly, then I think it would be, excuse me one second, thank you, then everyone would be, I think there'd be more of an argument for it. I think that we could do it in a much better way, but certainly in my area, there are very few masks to be seen. And when the bars opened up, the law said you weren't allowed to hang out at the bar. You could go, you could get your drink, and you could sit distance from one another at the table. But people were hanging out at the bar, and they were hugging each other, and they were, thank you, and they were hugging each other. And that undermines any possibility of real success, because yes, the economy needs to, the engines of the economy need to start working again, but nothing stops the economy more than mass death, right? So if we could do that, I would be more optimistic. Part of what's happening, part of what happened in the United States, and again, I don't know how it works in Iran, is, and this goes back to something we talked about a little earlier, things like masks and social distancing have become aligned with different political positions. And so you get the so-called blue states, the urban liberal states, where people are really abiding by the requirements because of the strong social density. Then you get the so-called red states and the more rural states where people think, oh, this is all just a liberal plot. Right, and we're not going to wear masks because masks are signs of weakness, and they're signs of ignorance, and ultimately that, you know, to be a good Republican, I have to not wear a mask. If we could avoid that, if we could heal that, if we could stop that, then I think that we could restart the economic engines quicker. But that's not going to happen. So instead, what we're going to get is continuing increased numbers in the rural areas where people thought were safe. And then the fall comes along and we'll have the second wave that every scientist has predicted. And it's going to hurt the people who aren't hurt right now. So I don't know. What I will say is that everyone keeps talking about shutting down, that the economy is shut down, and the economy hasn't been shut down. The economy has just shifted in very, very important ways. And so what you get, and this conversation is not new, you've all, I'm sure, been a part of it, where all of a sudden the delivery person is an essential worker. All of a sudden, you know, the person who works in the grocery store is an essential worker, where they were invisible beforehand. And so the economy exists. It's just a very different kind of economy. And what it isn't is a materialist economy, right? The world economy, especially in the United States and in the United Kingdom, it's a materialist economy in that it's an acquisition economy. There's a word in English that I'm trying to remember that I can't think at the moment. But people want stuff. They want lots and lots of stuff, and we're collectors and more, you know, more of this. Acquisitiveness. That's the term. Acquisitiveness. It's a very acquisitive economy, and right now we don't exist in an acquisitive economy. Right now we exist in an economy of disposal, and services, food, events, obviously medical supplies and things like that. And so what people aren't doing is buying a lot of stuff like they were doing 2 years ago because of economic uncertainty. So the economy is changing, but because the economy changed, the nature of jobs are changing, and because the nature of jobs are changing, the employment rates are changing. And whether that will continue, I don't know.
Jack, thank you so much. Our time is going to be finished by the alarming of the Instagram. Sorry, Jack.
No, that's fine. I just assumed that I just assumed that I was saying something very important and dangerous, and that both of our governments conspired to stop my comments.
Time limitation of the Instagram itself. So let me ask you one last question, if
Please,
I may.
please.
Thank
Of
you
course.
so much. During the crisis, we saw that the high potential of humanity for being irrational. You see, for instance, outlandish behaviors like leaking the holy shrines here in Iran, or leaking the cosmetics there in America. Of course, the state responsibly sent the holy shrine leakers to prison. But the problem is the capacity of human beings to be irrational. Also, we saw how widespread our conspiracy theories pervade here and there. Alternative pseudo-scientific medical treatments became so prevalent. Do you think it's time to re-emphasize on the significance and importance on scientific thinking and scientific methods?
You know, this is a tremendously important question. It's a question that actually has plagued philosophy since its very beginning, right? Socrates, or Plato has Socrates challenge people's abilities to govern themselves because only the philosophers were truly rational. And then you get different discussions about rationality throughout the centuries, leading to when John Locke and folks like that argued about rationality. They equated being rational with having the truth, right? And then in the 19th century, rationality changed. In the 20th century, you get a very analytic conception of rationality until you get to, and you are, of course, the perfect person to talk about this with, notions of tradition-bound rationality. And for those folks who have not, especially in Iran, who have not read Kaveh's translation of my book on McIntyre, please do so, because by all accounts, it's an outstandingly wonderful translation. He asked me, and I was incredibly honored to, I actually wrote a special preface for the Iranian edition on this very question, on rationality, what rationality means by the tradition. And of course, the English language version on McIntyre is also available, but doesn't have the preface and isn't as good because Kaveh wasn't involved. So the riddle that I start with in the preface is as follows. You have three people looking in a refrigerator, and there's a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian. And the Muslim opens the door and says, oh, so the Christian opens the door and says, oh, there's lots to eat. And the Muslim says, oh, there's one thing to eat. And the Jew opens the door and says, oh, there's nothing to eat, right? And what's in the refrigerator? And the answer is prawns, shrimp, pork. Shrimp and pork, right, are the two things, right? Because Christians can eat both. Muslims, depending on the denomination, will eat shellfish, and then Jews won't eat either, right? All three of those people are being rational. All three of those people have rules, assumptions about what counts as permissible food, and then are making logical deductions based on their foundational beliefs, right? It started getting windy, so if the wind is hitting the microphone and I need to move inside, please don't hesitate.
We can hear you well.
Okay, good. So when you look back at, say, John Locke or David Hume's conception of rationality, or certainly Plato's conception of rationality, those people don't make any sense because they have three completely different answers to the same question. But when you look at Alistair McIntyre and other people who see that rationality is built within a tradition, then what rationality means is the ability to make reasoned decisions within certain assumptions and within certain ideas. What we're seeing around the world are two entirely different problems. One is just inconsistency. One is just people being uneducated or not having any notion of what they did yesterday has anything to do with today. And those people are problematic for a different set of reasons. But then you're getting people who are making reasoned decisions based on assumptions that may be complete nonsense or may not be complete nonsense. So the people who are not wearing masks, right, and who are taking whatever crazy medicine Donald Trump tells them to take today, they're based on the assumption that liberals are crazy, Republicans tell the truth, and Donald Trump is a genius who has their best interest at heart. Now, I am sure everyone listening knows how I feel about those assumptions. But that aside, if you start with those assumptions, then doing the things that they're doing makes sense. So I don't think that the issue for those folks is that they're irrational. I think that the issue is that the overall both lack of good education combined with social prejudice leads them down a path that is corrupting of the human spirit and of the right answer. And the history of religions and the history of social movements and the history of humanity in general sees this pattern over and over and over again, right? If there's an example that I talk about one of the episodes of the radio show on misinformation, where the authors talk about how the person who first identified germs, germ theory, saw he was working in like a hospital, a place where among other things women gave birth, and he was seeing that that the people who were handling, he realized that there was a high mortality rate of the children based on when the doctors worked with cadavers, dead bodies, and so he encouraged everyone to wash their hands because he had the insight of germ theory. And the doctors refused to do it because they all thought of themselves as gentlemen, and gentlemen were not dirty, only the poor were dirty, right? And so their fundamental assumption prevented them from being able to make the right decisions. They were rational in their, once they accepted the fact that gentlemen were not dirty, everything followed. But that the lunacy of the assumption based on social prejudice and ignorance destroyed the system. So while I do think that consistency is very important, and while I do think that people have to understand that things have consequences, and that A is A, right? A is, A equals not A is, right, is not a useful way of looking at the world. I think what's more important around the world is a much more robust liberal education that keeps religion and literature and mythology and art as core aspects of learning, but also values the ability to incorporate scientific thinking in those worldviews, right? It is not hard to combine religion and science as long as you are not a tremendous fundamentalist. If you are a tremendous fundamentalist who believes not just in the revelation, right? I mean, you can believe in the revelation and understand that there is allegory in it, right? This is the debate of Ibn Rushd, right, and Al-Ghazali, right? The great medieval Islamic philosophers are engaged in this very debate, right? You'll know that the nonsense of the philosophers.
Contradictions of philosophers and contradiction of contradictions, in fact.
That's right. The classic Islamic texts, just like the classic Christian and Jewish texts, who are all talking with one another, right? Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali and Maimonides and Aquinas, they're all talking to each other, and they're all talking about the same thing, which is when you accept the revelation, do you have to accept that it's absolutely literal, that every reader has to read it in exactly the same way, or can you accept the fact that it is written for different audiences in different ways, and that it can be allegorical as well, right? So the great truth of the Quran, and of course, again, I don't want to overstep my expertise here, but the great claim of the Quran that all that is true is in the Quran and all that is in the Quran is true, is much more defensible if you understand that there are times when the Quran is being allegorical, because the Quran doesn't talk about automobiles or the internet. The Quran has tremendous insights that can be applied to the automobile and internet. And the same thing is true of the Hebrew scriptures, and the same thing is true of the Gospels, right? So what we have to do is we have to figure out a way to take the great conceptions of rationality and allow us to figure out how to incorporate them into the ways of thinking of people who need to reconceive their fundamental foundations. And of course, this was, if you'll allow me just one more tangent, this is what Aquinas was doing. In the West, when Aquinas is taught, Aquinas famously has 10 different arguments for the existence of God. Oh, no, it's Augustine who has the 10 different. Right, 5, thank you, 5. Right, so Aquinas has 5 arguments for the existence of God. And the way that it's always taught is Aquinas wants to convince the religious to.
Sorry, we don't have your voice now. We don't have
all right.
Voice now. I don't know why.
Okay.
Oh yes, everything.
Oh, is it back?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So, don't know what that was about. My apologies. So people always teach Aquinas as trying to use logic to prove the existence of God, but this is not what's going on at all, right? The West, the Christian West, loses Plato and Aristotle. He disappears. The Arab world, the Muslim Arab world specifically, preserves Aristotle, which of course you know, and keeps Aristotle, and then Aquinas, through a variety of factors, rediscovers this in around 1200. And he wants to argue for the importance of logic and the importance of Aristotelian logic. So what he says is, look, we know these truths from the Bible. We know they are true, and we are not questioning them. So I am going to use logic to get to the same truths, to prove to you not that religion is right, but that logic is right. Because if logic can come to the same truths that revelation come, then it must be a viable tool. It must be a good tool because it shows us what we already know. Aquinas is not trying to undermine religious belief. He's using the absolute conviction of religious belief in order to support logic. And I think we have to do something similar to Aquinas's project, which is to try to integrate the scientific rationality into the poetic, the mythological, the religious, and the bigoted worldviews, so that people can start to question the absurdity of their own assumptions, not to suggest that religion is absurd. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, right? But to suggest that it's not the irrationality that is the problem here. It's the starting points that are the problem. And if we can use their rational capacities to get them to challenge their starting points, it will end the crisis in religions that we're seeing now, right? In America, religion has less power than it's ever had before. In the United Kingdom, fewer people identify as religious as ever in history. I know that there are certain secular religious problems in Turkey, in Iran, oh, okay. All right, hold 1 second. Okay, no, that's okay.
Excuse me. I think your voice came back. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Okay.
Yeah. So I decided my microphones must have been dying or something. So now I'm just using the phone voice. So it might sound different, but it'll last. All I want to say is instead of looking at religion and scientific worldview and irrationality and considering human beings as irrational, if we can try to integrate these ideas, then the world as a whole will become a more educated population. And ultimately, this is a problem of bigotry and habit, I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jack, for attending this live. I really appreciate for accepting my invitation. And it was delightful talking with you about these topics. Thank you.
It is always my pleasure. As I said in the beginning, my relationship with Iran is tremendously important. My relationship with you is tremendously important as well. And I welcome all of your viewers and all of my viewers to contact me and follow up on all of these things. And I hope that we can have this conversation again, both because it's incredibly interesting to me, but also because in this time of global crisis, these kinds of conversations are the most important conversations, not because of what we're talking about necessarily, but because we are talking. That by talking and by respecting each other's intellect and by respecting each other's audience, we become a more cosmopolitan population, and it's much harder to kill people who you love.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Jack, and wish to talk to you again.
Thank you, Kaveh.
Good day.
Good day.